The photograph had been folded and unfolded so many times that the crease running down the center of Eudora Brenner's face had nearly worn through the paper, and yet Clement Crawford still pressed his thumb gently along her cheek every night before he slept, as if he were afraid she might disappear entirely if he stopped touching her. He had found the photograph by accident, or at least that was what he told himself on those long desert nights when the coyotes called to one another across the scrubland, and the stars hung so low above New Mexico territory that a man could almost believe he might reach up and cup one in his palm. The truth was more complicated than accident, as truth usually is, and it began not with him at all but with a dead man's coat. The dead man had been one Franklin Oakes, a cattle broker out of Abilene, Kansas, who had made the ill-advised decision to cheat at cards in a saloon in Tucson during the summer of 1878. The man who had caught him cheating had not been Clement, who was merely sitting at the bar drinking whiskey and minding the quiet that had become his only reliable companion in the years, since the war between the cattle outfits had swallowed up most of what he loved. The man who had caught Franklin Oakes cheating had been a short-tempered freight hauler named Dobbs, and what followed had been swift and ugly, and ended with Franklin Oakes' face down in the sawdust before the barkeep could even reach for the club he kept beneath the counter. Dobbs had ridden out before anyone could think too hard about stopping him. The sheriff of Tucson was a practical man who understood that chasing freight haulers across the desert for shooting card cheats was a poor use of good horses. Franklin Oakes had no kin anyone knew about. And so the matter of his coat, which had been hanging from the back of his chair, and which contained, among other things, a small tintype photograph in a cardboard sleeve, became the sort of unclaimed business that saloons accumulate the way creek beds accumulate sand. Clement had not asked for the coat. But when the barkeep, tired of looking at it, had swept it off its hook 2 days later and asked if anyone wanted it before he burned it, Clement had looked at the coat, looked at his own coat, which had seen 4 years of hard riding and was more patched than original cloth at that point, and had said yes. He was 28 years old and practical in the way that men who have survived difficult things learn to be practical, and a coat was a coat. He had found the photograph 3 days later, when he was checking the pockets out of habit before riding on. The cardboard sleeve was soft with handling, and when he opened it, he found her looking back at him. She was not what he would have described as a conventional beauty, not in the way that the women in the illustrated papers were beautiful, with their careful ringlets and their expressions of serene blandness. Eudora Brenner, though he did not yet know her name, had a face that seemed to be in the middle of deciding something important. Her brows were slightly drawn together. Her mouth was set with a firmness that suggested she had opinions and was not particularly interested in keeping them to herself. Her hair was dark and pinned up with what looked like more efficiency than artistry, several strands escaping at her temples in a way that made her look less like a portrait and more like a person who had been briefly interrupted in the middle of real living. On the back of the cardboard, in a handwriting that was not Franklin Oakes' rounded, careless scrawl, but rather something precise and deliberate, someone had written, Eudora Brenner, Hartwell, Colorado, 1877. Clement had sat on a flat rock in the Arizona sun for a long time looking at that name. He had turned the photograph over and looked at her face again. He had looked at the desert stretching away in every direction, bone pale and indifferent. He had thought about what it meant that this woman's image had been in a dead card cheat's coat pocket, and what it might mean that it was now in his hand. He put the photograph in his saddlebag. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself he would figure out what to do with it later. He told himself that Hartwell, Colorado was a long way from Tucson, Arizona, and that he had business in the other direction anyway, driving cattle up toward Las Cruces with a small outfit run by a man named Hennessy who paid fair wages and did not ask too many questions. He drove cattle for Hennessy through August and into September. He slept under the stars and ate beans from a tin, and listened to the other cowhands tell stories around the fire. And every night before he slept he checked his saddlebag. And every night the photograph was still there. And every night he looked at Eudora Brenner's face with her decided expression and her escaped strands of hair. And every night he put her away again and told himself he was not the kind of man who chased after photographs. He was, it turned out, exactly that kind of man. The cattle drive ended in Las Cruces in late September of 1878, and Clement Crawford collected his wages, bought a new set of horseshoes for his roan mare Persimmon, replenished his supplies, and pointed himself north. He did not announce his intentions to anyone. He was not sure even then that he had proper intentions. He told himself he was simply returning the photograph, which was a decent and responsible thing to do, and that he owed it to the woman in the image to let her know what had become of whoever had been carrying her likeness around in a coat pocket. He did not let himself think too hard about whether Franklin Oaks might have been someone Eudora Brenner was grieving. The ride from Las Cruces to Hartwell, Colorado was somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 miles as the crow flies, and considerably more as the horse walks, because crows do not have to navigate around mountain ranges and swollen rivers, and the particular stubbornness of terrain that the Rocky Mountain West seemed to produce in unlimited quantities. Clement had made long rides before. He had ridden from Texas to Kansas and back again more times than he could count without needing a second hand. He was comfortable in the saddle in the way that men are comfortable in conditions that have simply become the whole of their life. But this ride was different in a way he noticed without being able to name for most of the first 100 miles. He noticed it in the way he talked to Persimmon, which he had always done to some extent, as horses are good listeners and make no judgments, but which he now did more extensively, and on subjects he had not previously discussed aloud with anyone. He told the roan mare about the woman in the photograph. He described the set of her mouth, and the look in her eyes, and the handwriting on the back. He speculated about what her life might be like in Hartwell, Colorado, which he gathered from what little he knew of it was a small mining and ranching town that had come up in the last decade with the silver discoveries in that part of the territory. He wondered, and he did not say this to Persimmon, but he thought it in the quiet way that thoughts sometimes arrive when a man is riding alone for many hours, whether a woman who looked like that, who had that particular expression of someone about to make a decision, was happy in a small mining town. He wondered what she wanted out of her life. He wondered if she had people around her who deserved her. The second 100 miles took him through the San Juan Mountains, where the aspens had turned gold and trembled in the October wind like thousands of small flames, and where the air was so clean and cold it felt like drinking water every time he breathed. He passed through small settlements, stopping to water Persimmon and buy supplies, and he got into the habit, at each stop, of finding out what he could about Hartwell without making it obvious he was asking specifically. He learned that it was a real town, not a mining camp, with a proper main street and a church and a school. He learned it had been founded about 10 years ago and had survived the particular boom and bust cycle that killed most Western settlements by transitioning from mining income to ranching income with enough grace to keep people there. He learned nothing about a family named Brenner, because in small Western towns people did not discuss their neighbors with passing strangers, which he respected. The third 100 miles he spent in a state of increasing agitation that he refused to acknowledge as anything other than the natural restlessness of a man who had been riding for a long time. He stopped one afternoon beside a creek and took out the photograph and looked at it for longer than he had permitted himself to do since finding it. The crease down the center had gotten worse from the riding, and he worried briefly that it would eventually split, that Eudora Brenner's face would come apart along that line, and he felt a disproportionate distress at this idea that told him things about himself he was not quite ready to hear. He was not an uneducated man. He had grown up in Missouri with a mother who had pressed books into his hands, with the determination of someone who understood that a mind was a thing that needed feeding, and who had died when he was 19, still hoping he would do something with himself beyond riding horses and chasing cattle. He had read enough to know that what he was doing, riding 400 miles toward a woman whose name he had found on the back of a dead man's photograph, was the kind of thing that happened in stories. He was not naive enough to think that happening in stories made it sensible, but he could not stop riding north. The 400 miles brought him to the edge of Colorado's San Juan Basin, and then the foothills, and then the mountains proper, and on a cold, clear morning in late October of 1878, with frost on the grass and his breath coming in white clouds around his face, Clement Crawford rode into Hartwell, Colorado for the first time. It was a more substantial town than he had expected. The main street was broad enough for two wagons to pass each other comfortably, and it was lined on both sides with buildings that were mostly wood but showed signs of the kind of permanence that comes with investment and intention. There was a general store, a hotel, a bank, two saloons that faced each other across the street with what seemed like mutual wariness, a livery stable, a land office, a barber shop, a dressmaker's establishment, and at the far end a church whose white paint was so clean it seemed to reflect light. The school was a little off the main street, on a side road that led toward a cluster of modest houses, and it was from this direction that the sound of children's voices came drifting on the cold morning air. Clement rode to the livery first, because Persimmon had earned care after 400 miles of mountains and scrubland, and because he needed time to think before he did what he had come here to do. The liveryman was a broad, cheerful man named Otis Gallagher, who accepted Persimmon with the practiced eye of someone who genuinely liked horses and quoted a fair price for boarding and feed. He gave Clement water to wash with and pointed him toward the hotel without being asked, clearly reading the state of a man who had been riding hard for many days. "You looking for work or just passing through?" Otis asked, not unkindly. "Passing through, mostly," Clement said, which was not entirely a lie and not entirely the truth. He checked into the hotel, which was called the Hartwell House, and was run by a Mrs. Caldwell who was in her 60s, and had the serene efficiency of a woman who had long since stopped being surprised by anything, and he cleaned himself up with the basin of water and the small bar of soap that were provided, and he changed his shirt, and he sat on the edge of the hotel bed with the photograph in his hands. 400 miles, he thought. He had ridden 400 miles, and now he was in the right town, and he did not know where she lived or whether she was married or what in the world he was going to say when he knocked on her door. He sat there for what felt like a very long time. What he knew about himself at 28 years old was this: he was good with horses and better than average with cattle. He could read and write and do arithmetic. He was 6 feet and 1 inch tall, with hands that were roughened from years of rope work, and a face that the sun had weathered, but that his mother had once called handsome in a reliable sort of way, meaning not the kind of handsome that got you into trouble, but the kind that made people feel they could trust you. He had been raised Methodist and had lapsed in the specific way that the hard realities of Western life produced in men who thought about things, not with bitterness, but with a kind of wondering agnosticism that still occasionally found itself talking to God on difficult nights. He had never been in love. He had been fond of people, attached to people, and had done his share of the things that young men do, but he had never experienced anything that he would have described with that word. He suspected, sitting on the edge of the hotel bed in Hartwell, Colorado, that he was in considerable trouble. He put the photograph in his breast pocket, where he could feel it close, and went downstairs to find out what people in Hartwell knew about a family named Brenner. He did not ask at the hotel, because Mrs. Caldwell, for all her efficiency, had the look of someone who would remember the question and file it away for future use. He went instead to the general store, which was called Macintosh Goods and Sundries, and bought himself tobacco that he did not particularly need and some coffee and a small sack of dried beans. And while the young man behind the counter was weighing out the coffee, he said, in the most casual voice he could manage, I don't suppose you know a family named Brenner in town. I was asked to carry a message." The young man behind the counter, whose name turned out to be Patrick McIntosh, the owner's son, knew immediately and without any need for reflection. "Miss Eudora Brenner," he said. "Yes, sir, she's the schoolteacher. Lives in the White House on the east side of Collier Street." "Well, she lives in the house behind the school, really. Her father built it years ago when he was still alive. It's a small house, but you can't miss it. It's the one with the blue shutters." Clement thanked him and paid for his goods and walked out onto the main street in the cold October sunlight, and stood there for a moment with the coffee and the beans and the tobacco in his arms, looking down toward the east end of town where the school was, and where, presumably, the house with the blue shutters was, and where Eudora Brenner was at this moment teaching children their letters and their numbers. He went back to the hotel and put away his supplies and sat at the small desk in his room and looked at the wall for a while. He was not a coward. He had faced down stampedes and river crossings and lightning storms, and the particular brutal intimacy of having another man point a gun at him, all of which he had handled with a steadiness that other men had remarked upon. He understood that the steadiness came partly from character, and partly from not caring too much about the outcomes, which was a kind of freedom that came with having not much to lose. The problem now was that he cared enormously about the outcome, in a way that was ridiculous given that he had never exchanged a single word with this woman, and the caring made him someone who could apparently ride 400 miles through mountain country without significant difficulty, but could not seem to walk the 3 blocks to a house with blue shutters. He went to one of the saloons and had a meal of beef stew and bread that was better than he had expected, and he listened to the conversation around him with the practiced attention of a man accustomed to learning what he could from whatever room he was in. He learned that the Hartwell silver mine had played out 2 years ago, but that the cattle operations in the valley were doing well. He learned that a man named Grady Fitch owned most of the largest ranch and was generally regarded as prosperous and difficult. He learned that the school had been operating for 4 years, and that the previous teacher had left to get married in Denver, and that Miss Brenner had taken over the position and had been there since, and that the general opinion of Miss Brenner among the people who mentioned her, which was several people, and seemed to come up naturally in the flow of conversation, was one of considerable respect with a slight undercurrent of what he could only call affectionate exasperation. As if she were the kind of woman who improved everything she touched and made the people being improved feel slightly called out about it. This made him smile into his stew bowl. He learned, and this was both important and something he noticed himself attending to with particular sharpness, that no one mentioned a husband or a young man associated with Miss Brenner's name. He told himself that this meant nothing and could be explained by many things, and that it was none of his business regardless. He went to bed early and lay in the dark listening to the sounds of the town settling into its nighttime rhythms, and he thought about what the morning would bring. The morning brought frost on the window glass, and a sky the particular deep blue of high-altitude cold, and the sound of the church bell marking 7 o'clock. Clement dressed carefully, which was not something he usually gave much thought to, and brushed his coat and checked his boots, and stood at the small mirror on the washstand and looked at his face for longer than he had looked at it in years. He was not, he decided, a man whose appearance was going to be his best argument. He would have to rely on whatever it was he actually was. He put the photograph in his breast pocket, close to his heart, which he recognized as a sentimental thing to do and did anyway. He walked to Collier Street. The school came first, a neat rectangular building with windows on the south side to catch the light, and he could hear through those windows the sound of children reciting something in unison, a multiplication table from the sound of it, and a woman's voice guiding them, patient and clear, and with just enough edge in it to let him know she expected them to get it right. The house with the blue shutters was behind and to the right of the school, separated by a yard with a garden that had been put to bed for the winter, the soil turned and covered with straw. The house itself was small but looked well kept, the white paint fresh enough to suggest it had been applied within the last year or two. There was a woodpile on the north side stacked with the kind of careful precision that suggests the person who stacked it takes satisfaction in a job done correctly. He stood at the gate of the yard for a long time. A woman came out of the house next door, saw him standing there, and looked at him with the frank assessment of small-town eyes. He tipped his hat to her and she went back inside, apparently satisfied that he was not actively threatening anything. The school bell rang. He could hear it from where he stood, a small clear sound in the cold air, and a few minutes later children came tumbling out of the school building with the released energy of young animals let out of a pen, and they scattered in several directions, and then the door of the school opened again and a woman came out. He knew it was her immediately, not from the photograph, though that was certainly part of it. He knew it from the way she moved, which was with a purpose and a self-containment that matched the expression he had been studying for 4 months, and from the way she stopped at the top of the school steps and looked out at the yard as if making sure all her charges had gotten safely away, which was such a fundamentally Eudora Brenner thing to do. Though he had never met her, and did not yet know what was fundamentally Eudora Brenner, that he felt an absurd certainty about it. She was wearing a dark blue dress and a heavier coat over it, and her hair was up in the same efficient arrangement he recognized from the photograph, and she was carrying a stack of papers against her chest, and she was turning to go back inside when she noticed him standing at the gate of her house. She stopped. She looked at him. He looked at her. He had forgotten that photographs, even good ones, fail to capture certain things. They do not capture the particular way a person's eyes catch the light. They do not capture the quality of someone's attention when it is directed at you, which in Eudora Brenner's case was a thing of considerable intensity, the attention of someone who has trained herself to observe accurately and is doing so now. They do not capture the small things that make a face into a person, the precise curve of a mouth, the exact color of eyes in October light, which in her case was a kind of gray-green that he had not been able to determine from the tintype, and which he now found he would need a moment to adjust to. She crossed the yard between the school and her house and came to stand on her side of the gate, and she looked at him with that gray-green attention and said, "Can I help you?" "I hope so," he said, which was honest. "My name is Clement Crawford. I'm a cattle hand mostly. I've ridden up from Arizona." She waited. She was very good at waiting, he could already tell. Not the waiting of someone with nothing to say, but the waiting of someone who has learned to let other people finish. "I found something that I think belongs to you," he said. "Or, at least, that concerns you. I wasn't sure what the right thing to do was, so I wrote it here." Her brow drew together in that exact way it had in the photograph, the slight pull of someone working through something. "What did you find?" He put his hand into his breast pocket and took out the photograph and held it out to her. She looked at it for a moment before she took it from him. When she did, her expression changed in a way he could not fully read. She turned it over and read the back, and she was quiet for what felt like a very long time. "Where did you get this?" she said finally. Her voice was steady, but there was something beneath it. "From the coat of a man named Franklin Oakes," he said. "I should tell you what happened to him, because I think you deserve to know, and it's not pleasant, but it's the truth." She looked up at him then, and he saw that she had already guessed from his tone that it was not a good story, and that she was bracing herself with the particular straightness of someone who has had practice at receiving bad news. "Would you like to sit down?" he asked, because he felt it was the decent thing to offer. She looked at the gate between them, and then at him, and then she opened the gate and said, "Come inside. I'll put the kettle on." The inside of the house with the blue shutters was everything the outside had promised and more. It was small but arranged with such intelligence that it felt larger than it was, every surface performing 2 functions, every corner used. There were books everywhere, not stacked carelessly, but organized in a way that suggested they were consulted regularly. There was a rocking chair by the window with a small side table beside it that held a lamp and a book open face down. And this small domestic detail, the book left open in the middle of reading, made her feel suddenly and completely real to him, in a way that the photograph, for all its 4 months of company, had not quite achieved. She put the kettle on the small iron stove and gestured for him to sit at the kitchen table, which was covered with a cloth that was plain but clean, and she sat across from him with her hands folded in front of her and the photograph between them on the table, and she said, "Tell me." He told her about Franklin Oaks. He told her all of it, clearly and without embellishment, because she was not the kind of person you soften things for, and he knew it already. He told her about the saloon in Tucson, and the card game and Dobbs and the coat, and finding the photograph. He told her that he had not known what to do with it, and that he had carried it for the better part of 4 months before deciding that the only right thing was to bring it to her. When he was done, she was quiet for a long moment. She got up and poured the hot water over the tea leaves in the pot and brought it to the table with 2 cups and sat down again. "Franklin Oaks was my cousin," she said. "My father's sister's son. We were never close. He left Missouri when I was 16 and I hadn't seen him since, but I heard from him occasionally. He was not a good man, Mr. Crawford. I say that plainly because I think honesty serves us better than false sentiment. He borrowed money from my father that he never repaid, and I believe he was not above dishonesty in his dealings." She paused. "I gave him that photograph because he told me he was going out west and would write when he settled somewhere, and I thought it might remind him that he had family if he found himself in difficult circumstances. I did not imagine that it would end up in a stranger's coat." "No," Clement said. "I expect not. You rode 400 miles to return it," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, from Arizona. From Las Cruces, technically, by the time I pointed myself this direction, through the San Juans." She looked at him with that gray-green attention. "That is a considerable thing to do for a stranger. I thought you had a right to know what happened," he said, which was true and not all of the truth, and he suspected she knew it was not all of the truth. She poured the tea and pushed 1 cup toward him and wrapped both her hands around the other. Outside, the October wind was picking up, and the aspens at the edge of the yard threw moving shadow patterns across the kitchen floor. "You said you were a cattle hand," she said. "From where, originally?" "Missouri, as it happens. I grew up outside of St. Joseph." She looked up at that. "Missouri, whereabouts?" "A small place called Callaway Creek. You wouldn't know it." "I know Callaway Creek," she said, and for the first time something in her expression shifted toward something that was almost a smile. "My mother's family were from that area. Her maiden name was Holt. Do you know the name?" He thought about it. "Holt. There were Holts along the river road, yes. I was a boy when I left, but I remember the name." She was looking at him as if recalculating something. "What brought you west?" "Cattle," he said simply. "My father ranched. I inherited the skill if not the land. Went to Kansas when I was 20, Texas by 22, been drifting since then more or less in the direction of wherever the work was." "Are you drifting now?" There it was. He looked at the tea in his cup and then at her face and said, "I'm not sure what I'm doing now. I hadn't thought much past getting here." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said in a different kind of voice, one that was more careful, "Mr. Crawford, I am 26 years old and I am the schoolteacher in a small mountain town, and I have managed my own affairs quite successfully for several years. I am not someone who requires managing or rescuing. I want to say that clearly so we are not confused about it. I didn't come here to rescue you," he said. "Then why did you come here, truly?" He looked at her across the kitchen table with the afternoon light coming in through the window, and the aspen shadows on the floor and the smell of tea in the air. And he said, "Because for 4 months I have been carrying your photograph and talking to my horse about the look on your face, and I thought the least I could do was come and find out if the actual person was as interesting as I was already sure she was." The silence that followed this was very long, and he waited in it without trying to fill it. Then Eudora Brenner put her hand over her mouth, and he realized after a moment of startlement that she was laughing, not in a dismissive way, in the way of someone who has been surprised into genuine amusement by something they did not expect. "You talk to your horse about me," she said when she had composed herself. "Her name is Persimmon. She is an excellent listener." "I see." She was still smiling, and it transformed her face in a way the photograph had not been able to show him, opening it up, warming it. "And what did Persimmon think?" "She was reserved in her judgment," he said, "as she tends to be about people she hasn't met. But she seemed to find the general project worthwhile." Eudora looked at him for another of those long considering moments. Then she said, "Are you planning to stay in Hartwell for a time?" "I have no particular place I need to be," he said carefully. "Then perhaps," she said, "you might stay for a few days. There is a hotel on the main street, as I expect you found, and I could use some help with the woodpile before winter sets in properly." She glanced toward the window where the stacked wood was visible. "I say that not as a trade, but because it would be genuinely useful, and because it would give us time to talk in circumstances that are less one-sided." Less one-sided. "You know my face," she said, with a practicality that made him want to laugh. "You've had 4 months with it. I've had approximately 45 minutes with yours. The balance is rather in your favor." He stayed for more than a few days. He was not sure when the few days became a week, and then 2 weeks, and then the better part of a month. It happened gradually and then all at once, the way the best things in life seem to, and it happened because each morning he woke up in the Hartwell House Hotel and found that he was not ready to leave, and each day brought something new that cemented him more firmly in place. He split wood for her in the mornings, working through the stack that the previous winter had reduced and building it up again to a height that would see her through to spring. He did this without being asked to continue after the first day, and she did not ask him to stop, which he took as a kind of acceptance. While he worked, she was in the school, and in the afternoons when the children had gone, she would sometimes come out and lean against the fence and they would talk across the wood yard, she with her arms folded against the cold, he with the axe loose in his hand. And these conversations ranged everywhere, across childhood in Missouri and the war that had reshaped the country and books and what she thought about the future of Hartwell and what he thought about the future of, well, himself. Which was a question he had not spent much time on and found suddenly interesting to consider. She had a direct way of speaking that he discovered he had been missing without knowing it. He had spent years among men who communicated in the abbreviated shorthand of the working West, where saying too much was considered a kind of weakness and efficiency was valued over precision. Eudora had no patience for imprecision. If she meant something, she said it, and she expected the same in return, and when he gave it to her, he found the experience unexpectedly liberating. He met others in Hartwell during those weeks. He met Otis Gallagher, the liveryman, more formally, and found that he liked him. He met young Patrick McIntosh at the general store again, and found that the boy, who was 19 and not much younger than Clement had been when he first went west, was curious about the wider world in a way that was pleasant to talk to. He met the Reverend Hayes, who ran the church at the end of the street, with the serene composure of someone who had made his peace with the general sinfulness of humanity and had decided to focus on the parts he could improve. He met, inevitably, Grady Fitch, the cattle rancher, who was exactly as prosperous and difficult as reported, a large man in his 50s with money in his eyes and the permanent expression of someone who feels that the world is not quite acknowledging his importance sufficiently. Grady Fitch took an immediate dislike to Clement, and Clement, watching the man watch Eudora at a general gathering in the church hall one November evening, understood why. Grady Fitch was interested in Eudora Brenner, had probably been interested in her for some time, and had probably grown accustomed to being the most significant single man in Hartwell without serious competition. The gathering was the first one Clement had attended at Eudora's invitation, a community event organized by the church to collect winter supplies for families who needed help, and it was his first time seeing her in a social setting rather than the schoolyard or the kitchen of her house. She was different there, not less herself, but more visibly at ease, moving through the room with a natural authority that came not from position, but from the genuine regard of the people around her. Children ran to her. Old women held her hand and spoke to her privately. The men were respectful in the way they are respectful to women who have earned it rather than the way they are respectful to women they merely want something from. Grady Fitch approached her at one point during the evening, his hat in his hands in the formal gesture of social interest, and Clement, who was across the room discussing cattle prices with a neighboring rancher and half listening to everything else, watched Eudora's face during this conversation. She was polite. She was warm in the general way. She was warm with everyone. But she stood at a specific distance from Grady Fitch that she did not stand at from anyone else, a small but definitive distance that Clement recognized as the physical expression of a boundary. Later that evening, walking back to her house through the cold dark with their breath clouding in front of them, Eudora said without preamble, "Grady Fitch has asked me twice to consider his suit." Clement's step did not change. And I have declined twice, politely but clearly, which, as you may have gathered from conversations with anyone in this town, is not something Grady Fitch is accustomed to. "I gathered," he said. "He is not a bad man exactly," she said, with the fairness she brought to everything. "He is a man who has been told yes so often that he has forgotten that no is a valid answer. I find I have limited patience for that particular form of self-deception. Have you told him clearly that you are not interested?" "I have told him what I have told him," she said, with the slight edge that meant she was aware the formulation was careful. "He hears what he wants to hear. I suspect your presence in town is not making him any more content. Does that concern you?" She stopped at the gate of her house and looked at him in the darkness, her breath white between them. "It concerns me insofar as I dislike being the cause of other people's discomfort," she said. "Beyond that, no. My life is my own. I decide who has a place in it." "That's a clear thing to say," he said. "I am a clear person," she said, "when I know what I mean, which is not always but is more often than not." She went inside, and he walked back to the hotel through the cold Hartwell night feeling something in his chest that was warm and complicated and entirely outside his previous experience. The difficulty with Grady Fitch presented itself more concretely the following week, on a Tuesday afternoon when Clement was in the livery stable with Otis Gallagher discussing the merits of different winter feed arrangements, and Fitch came in with two of his ranch hands and stood in the middle of the livery in the way of large men who have decided they are entitled to take up space. "Crawford," Fitch said. "Fitch," Clement said. "How long are you planning to stay in Hartwell?" Clement thought about it. "I haven't decided yet. Because I wonder," Fitch said, "what exactly a drifting cattle hand finds to do in a small town for nearly a month." "I've been helping with the woodpile," Clement said, which was true and which he knew would be irritating, and which he said in the most even voice he owned because he was not interested in drama, but he was also not going to pretend to misunderstand the question. Fitch stepped closer. He was a big man and he used the bigness deliberately. "I'm going to be plain with you," he said. "I'd appreciate that," Clement said. "Eudora Brenner is a woman of quality in this town, and she doesn't need some drifter from Arizona blowing through and disrupting things." "She is indeed a woman of quality," Clement agreed. "And in my experience, women of quality make their own decisions about who disrupts things and who doesn't." Fitch's jaw tightened. One of his ranch hands shifted weight. Otis Gallagher behind them found something very interesting to examine near the far stall. "You should move on," Fitch said. "I expect I'll move on when I'm ready," Clement said. "Same as I always do. No offense intended, Mr. Fitch. I don't have any quarrel with you." "You may yet," Fitch said. "That would be a shame," Clement said pleasantly, "because I'm a boring man with simple tastes and I generally find quarrels to be more trouble than they're worth." Fitch held his gaze for a long moment, then turned and walked out with his ranch hands behind him, and Otis Gallagher emerged from the far stall with a grin he was clearly trying to control. "That went about as well as it could," Otis said. "I hope so," Clement said. I prefer it stays like that. He told Eudora about the encounter that afternoon. She listened with her arms folded and the particular compression of her lips that he had come to recognize as the expression she wore when she was choosing her words carefully. "He has no claim on me," she said when he had finished. "I know that, and I won't have my choices managed, even by well-intentioned people. I know that, too." She looked at him. "What did you say to him, exactly?" he told her. She was quiet for a moment, then, "That was well said. Thank you." It didn't antagonize him unnecessarily, but it didn't concede anything that wasn't his to take. That was the intention. She unfolded her arms and looked out the window at the cold November sky, and then she looked back at him and said in a different voice, quieter and more deliberate, "Clement." It was the first time she had used his given name, and it did something to him that he hoped was not visible on his face. "Yes. I want to ask you something directly, and I want a direct answer." "All right. Do you have any intention of staying in Hartwell?" "Not for a few more days. Genuinely, because if you don't, I would rather know now than later." He looked at her and did not look away. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what it would mean to stop drifting. I have been thinking about it harder here than I have anywhere in 10 years of riding west. And I think what I'm finding is that I was drifting because I didn't know what I was looking for, and now I think I might know. And so the question of staying or going is starting to mean something different than it did." She was very still. "That's as direct as I can be," he said, "without overstepping what I've earned the right to say." "You haven't overstepped," she said, and her voice was very careful, but her eyes were not careful, and what was in her eyes told him considerably more than her voice. Winter came down fully over Hartwell in the last week of November, snow filling the mountain passes and settling in deep drifts along the main street, and the world contracted the way it does in mountain winters, drawing people closer to their fires and each other. Clement had not left. He had, in fact, made arrangements of a slightly more permanent nature. Otis Gallagher had offered him work in the livery through the winter, which was needed because one of Otis's regular hands had gone south for the season and Otis had more horses than he could comfortably manage alone. Clement had accepted, and moved his things from the hotel to a room above the stable that was small but warm, and which he did not mind at all. He was settled, or as settled as he had been since Missouri, and he found the settledness did not chafe at him the way he had half expected it to. He found instead that Hartwell was a town that rewarded the people who stayed in it, that its rhythms were the kind of rhythms you could build a life around if you were willing to put down roots, and he was surprised to find himself willing in a way he had not been willing before. Every Sunday he walked to church with Eudora, which had become a natural arrangement arising from the fact that their routes crossed, and that neither of them was the kind of person who would walk past a familiar face without greeting it. They sat in adjacent pews and afterward walked together through the cold streets, and these Sunday mornings had acquired a quality of ritual that felt to him like something he did not want to give up. He had supper at her house twice a week. She was a good cook in the practical, unstinting way of someone who has fed themselves competently for years and has no interest in pretension, and he was a genuinely appreciative audience, having spent too many years eating his own cooking over campfires. They talked through these suppers in the way that two people talk when they are genuinely interested in each other's minds, ranging through everything and nothing, arguing occasionally in the productive way of people who respect each other enough to disagree. And the evenings always stretched longer than they should have before he put on his coat and walked back through the snow to the stable. He kissed her for the first time on a December night after a supper that had gone on until the fire burned low, and the snow was falling thick and steady outside her windows. He had stood at the door with his coat on and his hat in his hand, meaning to say good night, and she had been standing close in the small hallway, and they had both been quiet for a moment in the particular way of two people who are aware of the same thing simultaneously. He had put his hand against her cheek, which was warm from the fire, and she had turned her face slightly toward his hand, and he had kissed her softly and carefully, and she had kissed him back with a warmth that undid him entirely. When they parted, she looked up at him with those gray-green eyes that he had been looking at for more than 5 months now, since he had first found her in a coat pocket, and she said, "I have been very patient." He laughed, a real laugh that felt like something coming loose in his chest. "I know you have. I generally find patience is rewarded," she said, with the particular composure of someone who is very happy and is allowing themselves to know it. He walked back through the snow feeling like a man who has arrived somewhere he did not know he was heading toward, but recognizes clearly now as the place he was always going. December was good. December was very good. Christmas came and the town gathered, and there was singing in the church and a dinner at the hall, and Eudora sat beside him through all of it with her shoulder warm against his, and he thought, looking at her in the candlelight, that the photograph had been a remarkable thing, a piece of paper in a dead man's pocket that had rerouted the direction of his life, and he felt toward Franklin Oaks something that was not quite gratitude but was in the neighborhood of it. There was a moment in the new year, January of 1879, when things with Grady Fitch came briefly to a head. Fitch had not been content to let the situation lie, and his discontent had found expression in the way that wealthy men's discontent often does, through influence rather than direct confrontation. He had words with Otis Gallagher about the wisdom of employing a drifter who might leave come spring. He raised questions at a town meeting about standards of conduct and stability that were aimed at no one in particular, and quite clearly at Clement in particular. He spoke to Reverend Hayes about proper courtship practices in ways that Reverend Hayes, who was a man of genuine decency, found embarrassing and declined to act upon. Eudora, who was not unaware of any of this because small towns have an information circulation faster than any telegraph, addressed it in her characteristic fashion. She went to Grady Fitch at his ranch, alone, on a cold January afternoon, and she told him plainly that his conduct was causing difficulties for people she cared about, and that she expected it to stop. She told him that her personal choices were not now, and had never been subject to his approval. She told him that she respected his position in the community, and hoped they could continue as neighborly people, but that she would not allow herself or those she valued to be managed by his displeasure. Clement learned about this conversation the way he learned most things Eudora did on her own behalf, which was from other people before he heard it from her, and when she told him about it herself that evening, matter-of-factly and without apparent concern for his reaction. He sat across from her and felt a surge of something that was partly admiration and partly the particular protectiveness of someone who understands that the person they love is fully capable of protecting themselves and loves them more for it. "You went to his ranch," Clement said. "He was not going to stop on his own," she said. "He needed a clear statement." "Was he unkind to you?" "He was startled," she said. "Men like Grady Fitch are not accustomed to women going to them directly. He will be fine. He is not ultimately a bad man, and I believe he heard me. And after he will adjust his understanding of the situation," she said, "the way people generally do when the situation is made clear enough." She was right, as it turned out. Grady Fitch did not become cordial overnight, but the deliberate interference stopped, and within a few months the relationship had settled into the cool, mutual acknowledgement of two people who have no quarrel but no particular warmth either, which was about as much as anyone could reasonably ask. The winter passed, and then the spring came up through the mountains slowly and then all at once, the way mountain springs do, and the aspens put out new leaves that were gold-green and trembled in the April wind, and the snowmelt filled the creek that ran along the east edge of town so full that it sang over its rocks all day and into the night. Clement had been in Hartwell for 6 months. He had stopped counting. He was not sure when he stopped counting, only that at some point the days had ceased to feel like an accumulation and had started to feel like just his life. He bought a ring in April from the general store's small collection of such things, a simple silver band that was not remarkable in itself, but which he spent an embarrassing amount of time looking at in the palm of his hand before he went to find Eudora. He found her in the schoolyard at the end of the school day, standing by the fence watching the children go home, which was her habit, and he came and stood beside her and they were quiet together for a moment while the last of the children disappeared around the corner of the street. "I've been thinking," he said. "I have noticed," she said, "that you have been in a particular mood for several days." "What kind of mood?" "The kind," she said carefully, "that a person gets when they have decided something and are working up to saying it." He looked at her. She looked at him. The April wind moved through the aspens at the edge of the yard. "I want to stay," he said. "Not because I've nowhere else to go or because I'm tired of riding, although that last part may have some truth to it. I want to stay because you are here, and because I want a life here with you if you want that. I'm not a wealthy man, and I'm not a man with a great deal to offer beyond the fact that I would spend the rest of my life trying to be worth what I'm asking for. But I'm asking." He took the ring out of his pocket. She looked at it in his palm, and then she looked at his face, and what was on her face in that moment was something so open and unguarded that he felt the privilege of seeing it all the way through to his bones. "Yes," she said, simply and completely. He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it and then looked up at him, and he kissed her in the schoolyard of Hartwell, Colorado, with the April wind in the aspens and the creek singing over its rocks, and she put her hand against his chest, and he could feel her palm over his heart. They were married in June. The Reverend Hayes performed the ceremony with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has been watching two people move toward each other for months and is glad to see them arrive. The church was not large, but the whole town was there, or very nearly, because small towns take their celebrations seriously, and because Eudora Brenner was someone whom Hartwell had claimed as its own, and her happiness was therefore a communal occasion. Otis Gallagher stood up with Clement, having acquired in 6 months the kind of friendship that some men build in decades, a friendship of shared work and honest conversation, and the particular regard that grows between people who see each other's character clearly and like what they see. He had been the first person Clement told about the proposal, and he had shaken Clement's hand and said, "About time," with a grin that Clement had found both irritating and entirely correct. The schoolchildren had made a banner for the occasion that said, "Miss Brenner and Mr. Crawford," in the mixed lettering of a dozen different hands, and Eudora had pressed her hand to her mouth when she saw it in a way that she rarely allowed herself in public. And Clement, standing beside her and seeing it, had thought about a photograph in a saddlebag, worn thin with handling, and how strange and merciful it was, the way things worked. He had kept her photograph. He still had it. He put it in the frame on the small table by their bed in the house with the blue shutters, which was now their house, where they both lived and would continue to live, and she had found it there one morning and looked at him over it with an expression he could not entirely decode. "You're keeping it?" she asked. "If you don't mind," he said. "It means something to me. It's where everything started." She set the framed photograph back on the table. "You know what I find strange about it," she said. "What?" "When I look at it, I always think that person looks like she's about to make up her mind about something." "She was," he said. "She just didn't know it yet." Eudora looked at him, and he saw the smile beginning at the corners of her eyes before it reached her mouth. He had work to do in Hartwell. Otis Gallagher had offered him a partnership in the livery, which was growing enough that one man could not manage it properly, and which with 2 men and some expansion could become a solid business, serving not just Hartwell but the surrounding valley. Clement had savings from years of cattle work, not a great deal but enough for a start, and he and Otis had spent many winter evenings working through the numbers with the care of men who had both been poor enough to know that a wrong calculation can cost everything. They expanded the livery in the summer after the wedding, adding a second stable block and a proper smithy, hiring a young man named Danny Flores who had come up from New Mexico territory looking for work, and who turned out to have a gift for working with horses that was something close to remarkable. The business did well. Hartwell was growing, slowly and steadily. the kind of growth that comes from being a good place to live rather than from a boom that will inevitably bust. And a livery at the center of a growing town is never short of custom. Eudora continued teaching, and this was not a negotiation that required much work because Clement understood from the first moment. He understood anything about her that her work was as much a part of who she was as her name, and that any man who loved Eudora Brenner, who had become Eudora Crawford on a June morning but who remained entirely Eudora Brenner in all the ways that mattered, loved her work too. He attended the school exhibitions and listened to the children recite what she had taught them with a pride that still sometimes surprised him with its intensity. He helped her carry the large books home when she needed to grade papers in the evening. He lit the fire in the school stove on winter mornings before she arrived, so that the room would be warm when the children came. She read to him in the evenings. This had started almost accidentally, a habit formed in the long winter evenings when he had been learning that a marriage made of two people who both like silence is a particular kind of luxury, and that the silence of reading together is different from the silence of solitude, warmer and more full of its own content. But she also liked reading aloud, and he liked being read to, and they had spent many evenings by the fire with her reading and him working at some small task, mending tack or sharpening tools, and the sound of her voice had become one of the fundamental sounds of his life in the way that home sounds do when you have finally found somewhere that is yours. In the second year of their marriage, the autumn of 1880, Eudora told him she was expecting a child. She told him on an October morning, which seemed appropriate, given that everything seemed to have happened to them in October. She said it directly and without ceremony, which was how she did most things, and he set down the coffee cup he was holding because his hands suddenly needed to be empty for whatever was happening in his chest. "Clement," she said, watching him. "I'm all right," he said. "I'm more than all right. I'm trying to find the right word." "Take your time." "Grateful," he said finally. "I keep coming back to grateful, which seems insufficient, but it's what I have." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his palm up and held her hand, and they sat in the October morning light of the house with the blue shutters and were quietly in the midst of something enormous. He was with her through the pregnancy with the attentiveness of a man who is not entirely sure what is useful and is therefore doing everything. He negotiated with Otis to rearrange his hours at the livery so that he was home at midday. He learned to cook 3 dishes competently, which was 3 more than he had previously managed. He walked with her in the evenings through the streets of Hartwell, their pace adjusting as the months passed, and he held her hand the whole time. He asked her one evening in the spring what she wanted to name the baby if it was a boy. She thought about it for a long time, which was her way. "I like the name Thomas," she said. "My father's name was Thomas." "Thomas Crawford," he said, trying it. "Or," she said, and there was a slight quality to the word that told him she was about to say something she had been considering privately for some time, "Thomas Franklin Crawford, if you thought that was appropriate." He looked at her. "It seems like a strange thing to feel," she said carefully, "but Franklin Oaks, for all his faults, is part of why we are here. Without his photograph in a coat pocket in a saloon in Tucson, you would not have had anything to ride 400 miles with." Clement was quiet for a moment. "Thomas Franklin Crawford," he said, "only if you think it fits." "I think it fits very well," he said. Their son was born in June of 1881, which made him a child of the same month as his parents' wedding and seemed to Clement, who was not superstitious, but was appreciative of meaningful coincidences, a good sign. Thomas Franklin Crawford came into the world with a full head of dark hair like his mother, and a disposition toward loud and immediate complaint that seemed very much his own, and Clement held him in the lamplight of the bedroom with his hands that were rough from rope work and stable work and all the years of West Country living, and looked at this small, complete person, and felt the world reorganize itself around him. Eudora, who had been magnificent throughout the whole business in the way she was magnificent at everything, looked at him holding the baby and said, "You look terrified." "I am terrified," he said honestly. "That's appropriate," she said. "Anyone who isn't terrified hasn't understood the situation. Does it get less terrifying?" "I have been told," she said, with the careful qualification of someone who is relaying second-hand information, "that it changes character. It does not apparently go away." "Wonderful," he said, looking down at Thomas Franklin Crawford, who had stopped complaining and was now looking up at him with the unfocused gravity of very new people. Thomas was, from the beginning, a child who required the whole of any room he was in. He was physically fearless and verbally precocious, and he had his mother's expression of someone who is perpetually in the middle of deciding something important, which Clement found so simultaneously familiar and knew that it sometimes made him have to look away. He was also, almost from the moment he could communicate preference, desperately interested in horses, which Clement attributed to the amount of time spent in the livery, and which Otis Gallagher received as a personal compliment. By the time Thomas was 2 and beginning to speak in the earnest, rushing way of children who have too many things they want to say, Hartwell had grown further, a new family moving in every few months, the school needing a second classroom that Eudora had been petitioning the town council for, and finally received in 1883, when Thomas was almost 3, and beginning to take up residency under his mother's desk during school hours on the days when Clement needed to be at the livery. They added to the house in that year too, a second bedroom and a sitting room off the back, because the small house with the blue shutters, which had been everything for Eudora alone, and then for the 2 of them, needed more space for 3 people and the accumulated evidence of a shared life, the books and the tools and the extra blankets, and all the ordinary abundance of a household that has settled in. In 1884, Eudora was expecting again, and this time the pregnancy was easier, or she said it was, with the qualifier of someone who had the previous experience as reference point. In February of 1885, their daughter was born, and they named her Ruth Josephine Crawford, Ruth for Eudora's grandmother and Josephine for no particular reason, except that it sounded right when you said it alongside Ruth and Thomas and Crawford. Ruth was very different from Thomas. Where Thomas had come into the world announcing himself, Ruth arrived as if she had decided to take stock of the situation before committing to an opinion, and maintained this quality of watchful assessment into infancy and beyond. She was, Clement told Otis Gallagher one afternoon, his daughter in disposition, which he meant as the highest compliment he was capable of giving. "You've gone soft," Otis said, with the affection of someone who was extremely glad to witness it. "Completely and without regret," Clement agreed. The livery was thriving by the mid-1880s, expanded again in 1885 to accommodate the increased traffic through Hartwell as the valley population grew. Danny Flores had become a full partner, which he had earned 3 times over, and had brought his younger brother Miguel in to work, and the 3 of them ran the operation with the smooth efficiency of people who each know what they're good at and trust each other accordingly. Clement had taken on a secondary role as something between a horse trader and a transport consultant for the surrounding ranches, buying and selling horses with an eye for quality that the valley ranchers had come to rely on, and this work suited him in the way of things that combine what you're good at with what you enjoy without requiring you to become someone else. He and Eudora were, in 1885, on the far side of 6 years of marriage, which was long enough that the neighborhood had ceased to be particularly romantic in the conventional sense, and had become instead the particular intimacy of people who know each other fully, who have seen each other sick and tired and frightened and foolish, and who have chosen, repeatedly, and in the small daily ways that matter more than grand gestures, to remain. He still kissed her good morning every day without fail, which was a habit that had started in the first month of marriage and had never stopped. She still read to him in the evenings, and he still worked beside her reading and was still moved, after all this time, by the sound of her voice in a room he lived in. There was an evening in the autumn of 1885 when he came home from the livery to find her standing at the kitchen window with the sunset light on her face, and both children audible but not yet visible somewhere in the back of the house. And he stood in the doorway and looked at her for a long moment before she heard him come in. She was 33 years old. There were a few threads of silver in her dark hair now, and the lines at the corners of her eyes were more established than they had been in the photograph that he had found. But the expression was the same, the expression of someone perpetually in the middle of deciding something, and the gray-green eyes were the same. And she was so completely herself, so entirely Eudora, that he felt the same thing he had felt in the kitchen of this house on the first afternoon he had sat at this table. Which was that here was a person he wanted to know for the rest of his life. "You're staring at me," she said, without turning around. "Yes," he said. "You do that sometimes," she said. "I know." She turned and looked at him from across the kitchen, and what was on her face was what had been there more and more in the years of their marriage, the openness that she allowed with him that she did not allow anywhere else, the visible happiness of someone who has found exactly what they wanted and is not shy about knowing it. "Come in and close the door," she said. "It's cold." He came in and closed the door and crossed the kitchen and kissed her in the October evening light, the way he kissed her every day, which was like something that mattered, because it did. Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway with a lizard in his cupped hands that he wanted to show his father, and Ruth appeared behind him at approximately knee-height with her watchful expression, and her arms folded in an unconscious mimicry of her mother that made both her parents have to control their expressions. The kitchen filled with the noise of children and the smell of whatever Eudora had had simmering on the stove, and Clement took the lizard from Thomas and pretended to admire it with the seriousness his son required, and Ruth came and pressed against his leg with the proprietary affection of small children for their parents, and the house contained all of them in the way that the right home contains the people who belong to it. Later that night, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Clement sat at the kitchen table with the last of the evening's coffee and took out the framed photograph from the shelf where it now lived, not on the bedside table anymore, but on the kitchen shelf where he could see it during meals, where it had migrated naturally over the years. The photograph was more worn than ever, the paper thickened at the crease from too many hands in too many pockets. But her face was still clear in it, that decisive expression, those escaped strands of hair, and he sat with it in his hands and thought about a saloon in Tucson and a dead man's coat and 400 miles of mountain country and a gate with a house behind it that had blue shutters. Eudora came and sat beside him, not across from him as she had sat that first afternoon, but beside him, close, her shoulder against his, and she looked at the photograph with him. "I was 25 when that was taken," she said. "My father had just bought the camera from a man passing through. He was so pleased with it. He took photographs of everything that week, the school and the house and the yard. Most of them came out terribly, but that one he was proud of. He had good reason to be," Clement said. She was quiet a moment. "What do you think you would have done," she said, "if you had never found it? Where would you be?" He thought about it seriously because she deserved a serious answer. "I don't know," he said. "Drifting still, most likely. Las Cruces, maybe California. I would not have known what I was missing." "That's the most frightening version," she said. "Not knowing what you're missing." "Yes," he agreed. She put her hand over his on the table, her fingers over his fingers. Outside, the wind was picking up, the way it did in Hartwell in the evenings when the temperature dropped, and the fire in the stove ticked steadily with its small domestic sounds. "I'm glad you found it," she said. "So am I," he said, "frequently and with my whole heart." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she did sometimes in the evenings when the day had been long and they were both tired and satisfied, and he felt the weight of her head against him, and the warmth of her hand over his and the sound of the wind outside and the fire inside, and he thought that if he had known, riding out of Tucson with a dead man's coat and a photograph he hadn't asked for, that 400 miles of desert and mountains would bring him to exactly this. he would have ridden faster. The years continued to do what years do in a good life, which is to accumulate without feeling like accumulation, building up the way creek beds build up, a layer at a time, each new layer becoming part of the whole. Thomas grew into a boy of considerable energy and opinion who was, by all accounts, going to be tall and was already, at age 6, beginning to have complex negotiations with his mother about the time he was permitted to spend in the livery versus the time he was expected to spend on his lessons. These negotiations, Clement observed with the private amusement of a father watching a child attempt to outsmart someone who is constitutionally incapable of being outsmarted, were not going particularly well for Thomas. Ruth, at 3 and then 4, was developing the kind of focused intensity that occasionally alarmed visitors who were not used to a small girl who looked at you as if she were reading you and finding you generally adequate. She had shown, quite early, an absolute attachment to books, any books, which she would spend long periods turning the pages of whether or not she could yet read them, as if the physical presence of the words was sufficient for now. Eudora found this gratifying in a way that made Clement suspect that Ruth was going to be a teacher herself someday, which he thought was exactly right. He had written, in the early years of the marriage, to his mother's sister in Missouri, his only remaining family, to let her know where he was and how he was. He had not expected much, given the years and the distance, but she had written back, a long letter full of Missouri news and family history, and a warmth that crossed the years and miles intact, and they had continued to correspond, and she had sent a gift when Thomas was born, a small quilt made of fabric scraps from a dozen different garments, and another when Ruth arrived, and these quilts were on the children's beds and would stay there for many years. Otis Gallagher married, in 1886, a woman named Clara who had come to Hartwell to stay with her sister and had decided to remain, and who was large-spirited and funny, and clearly the best possible thing that had ever happened to Otis. Clement and Eudora stood up for them the way Otis had stood up for Clement, and the four of them settled into the kind of friendship between couples that becomes one of the structural elements of a life, the people you celebrate with and worry with and argue with about nothing important on Sunday afternoons. In 1887, Patrick McIntosh, who had been 19 when Clement first arrived in Hartwell, and who was now in his late 20s and had taken over his father's store, asked Clement one afternoon in a roundabout way that made Clement think of his own early attempts at directness, whether he thought it was foolish to pursue a woman who was quite a bit more educated than himself. Clement, who had some experience with women who were quite a bit more educated than himself, told Patrick that the question was not whether you were educated enough, but whether you were honest enough, and whether you genuinely valued the person for who she was rather than who you imagined her to be, and that if both of those things were true, then the education gap would take care of itself. Patrick had gone away looking thoughtful, and 6 months later he was engaged to a young woman named Helen who had come to Hartwell as Eudora's teaching assistant, which Clement considered a satisfactory outcome all around. The town kept changing and the livery kept growing and the school kept filling, and Hartwell became, over those years, the kind of community that holds its people rather than releasing them, the kind of place where the second generation grows up and stays and the third generation begins to arrive, because the roots have gone deep enough to hold. Clement Crawford was 40 years old in 1890, and if someone had asked him to account for his life from 28 to 40, he would have said that the first part of that account, the drifting years, was the story of a man waiting to find out what he was for, and that the second part, which was everything from the October afternoon in Tucson when he put a photograph in a saddlebag, was the story of a man who found out. Thomas, at 9, was reading with the appetite of his mother and had begun, under protest but with a facility that could not be denied, to show an aptitude for arithmetic that delighted Eudora and surprised Clement, who had always thought of mathematics as a tool rather than a pleasure. Ruth, at 5, had started school and was already, within the first month, demonstrating that she had opinions about how it should be run, which Eudora received with the complicated expression of a teacher, confronting her own methodology, reflected back at her from a child who was not quite her student and not quite her colleague, but some new category as yet unnamed. There was an afternoon in the late summer of 1890 when Clement and Eudora walked to the top of the hill above Hartwell, the long slope of meadow above the town that they had discovered in the first summer of their marriage and returned to often, and sat in the late light with the whole valley spread below them and the mountains beyond, blue and enormous in the distance. It was a habit they had kept through the years, this walk, adjusting for seasons and weather and the occasional logistics of children. It was one of the places where they talked about things that required the particular quiet of open country, the large subjects that did not fit well in houses. "I have been thinking," Eudora said, sitting on the grass with her knees drawn up and her arms around them, looking out at the valley, "about the school, about the second classroom. What about it? I think we need a third," she said, "and a second teacher who is not an assistant but a full teacher, her own room and her own students, with me coordinating rather than doing everything. Have you talked to the council?" "Not yet. I wanted to think it through first." She paused. "I also wanted to tell you, because I wanted you to know that if we do this, if I take on the organizing of it rather than the direct teaching, it is going to take more time from me for a while. The meetings and the paperwork and the hiring." "I know," he said. "You don't mind." He looked at her with the look that he had had for 12 years now, the look of someone who finds the question slightly baffling because the answer is so obvious. "I never mind your work," he said. "You know that." "I know," she said. "I ask anyway because I think it matters asking even when you know the answer. It matters that you're asked and that you choose." "Then yes," he said, "freely and entirely, do the work. Build the school. I'll figure out dinner more often." She smiled at the valley. "You're better at it now than you were." "I have had 12 years of instruction from a woman who does not believe in imprecision." "The biscuits are still inconsistent," she said. "The biscuits," he said with dignity, "are improving." She laughed, and the sound of it went out into the summer air over the valley and was gone, but it stayed in him the way her laughter always did, warm and particular in his. Below them, Hartwell sat in its valley with the afternoon sun on its rooftops and the creek flashing bright at its eastern edge. They could see from here the school building, larger now with its additions, and the steeple of Reverend Hayes's church, and the long roofline of the livery, and if they looked carefully, the small splash of color that was the blue shutters of the house where they lived. The house with the blue shutters. Their house. The one with the woodpile on the north side, always well stacked, and the garden that grew something every summer and was put to bed every fall with care, and the books on every surface, and the children's voices, and the coffee in the mornings, and the fire in the evenings, and the photograph on the kitchen shelf, worn thin at its crease, showing a woman with her mind made up and her whole life ahead of her. Clement took Eudora's hand in his, the way he had taken it 10,000 times, and she turned her palm to meet his without looking away from the valley, the easy accommodation of two people who know where each other's hands are even when they're not looking. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd left?" she said. "After those first few days, before we'd spoken much." "I think I would have come back," he said. "From where?" "From wherever I went," he said. "I think I would have ridden away and gotten about 50 miles and turned around." She considered this. "That is probably right," she said. "You had a particular look about you that first week." "What kind of look?" "The look of a man who has arrived somewhere he wasn't expecting to arrive and hasn't decided yet whether to admit it." "That is a precise description," he said. "I told you," she said, with the satisfaction that had always been in her voice when she turned out to be exactly right about something. "I am a clear person when I know what I mean." He brought her hand to his mouth and kissed her knuckles, which made her look at him finally, turning from the valley to him, and he saw in her face at 41 what he had seen in her face at 26, and at every age between, the person she was, Entirely and without apology, the woman who had looked out of a photograph from a dead man's coat pocket and redirected the whole of his life with nothing more than the expression on her face. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him with that slight narrowing that meant she was working something out. "For what?" "For being the kind of person who was worth 400 miles," he said. The silence that followed was the full, complete silence of two people who do not need to fill it, who have learned the texture of each other's quiet the way they've learned the texture of everything else, the way you learn the grain of wood you've worked with for years, by heart, by hand, without having to think about it. Then she said, quietly and with her whole self behind it, "I think you were always worth finding, Clement. I think you just needed something worth riding toward." He sat with that and let it be true, which it was, which he had known for years but which still landed with weight each time she found a new way to say it. The sun moved down the sky, and the shadows of the mountains lengthened across the valley, and eventually they walked down the hill together toward Hartwell and the house and the children and the evening, and the photograph on the kitchen shelf caught the last of the day's light through the window, and the woman in it looked out with her decided expression into the warm room that was full of everything it had taken 400 miles of mountain country to find. It had been enough. It had been more than enough. It had been everything. And in the house with the blue shutters in Hartwell, Colorado, in the autumn of 1890, with the aspens going gold again on the hill above the town, and the creek running bright over its rocks, and two children doing lessons at the kitchen table, and a man and a woman coming home through the evening together, the story that had started with a photograph in a dead man's coat arrived, as the best stories do. Not at an ending but at a place so full and so settled, and so deeply rooted that ending became an irrelevant concept. Because this, all of this, was simply what life looked like when everything had worked out right.